And I won't say that the Chinese Revolution, quite contrary to the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution was a peasant revolution. It was a peasant revolution. Because of small number of workers, or rather we can say because the working class in China was very small due to lack of industries, then Mao Zedong has no other option but to use the peasant of China, who were the majority. So you can see this is the group of Chinese peasants who were fighting with Mao Zedong during the process of the Chinese Revolution. We say, as we said earlier, the Chinese Revolution was achieved after a very long series of civil war which was fought in China to 1949. My dear students, let's now go to look at the causes for the Chinese Revolution. What really caused the Chinese Revolution? A lot of things, political, social, and economic issues and events have contributed to the Chinese Revolution. But the first cause to the Chinese Revolution is the huge Chinese population. Huge Chinese population. Population of China was so large. As we can see today, it extends to 1.45 billion people. But during those days, the Chinese, during 1949, according to the census of 1953, that means some 4 years after revolution, the Chinese were about 583 million people. So you can imagine, 583 million people. That's a very, very huge number of people. So the Chinese population was very, very high. And unfortunately, the government of China could not provide enough social services to those Chinese people, could not provide enough employment. The Chinese people were living in a deep poverty. So it's because of those problems that people of China had no other option but to support revolution. The second point is the poor economy and poor socio-economic infrastructures. The economy of China was very poor. In spite of being largest country with a lot of resources, but China was very poor in terms of development. China was very poor at development in industry. So it was purely agrarian state. But most important, transportation system were very backward in China. And in China, remember, as I said, it was very huge country, mountainous country. So sometimes some places in China were totally disconnected from the from the headquarters of the country, from Beijing, and transportation of people and food was very difficult. So one place of China can be producing a lot of food, but it was difficult for that food or other products to reach the other part of China because of poor transportation network. Due to geographical conditions of China, but also poor technological development. But most important, people who were very poor, they were very highly taxed, and that contributed to, to people supporting revolution. It's also because of this poor transportation, that in October 16th, 1934 to 35, October 1945, that means in 1 year, Mao Zedong led a long march to escape the nationalist forces and gain support of communists in the village areas. That means there is what is called a long march, where the group of communists led by Mao Zedong, in trying to escape the nationalist soldiers from Beijing, then he started to walk from one part of China to the other end of China. In fact, it was a 10,000 kilometers walk from one part of China to another, and this is called a long march. It started on October 16th, 1934 to October 19th, 1935. That means it was a 1 year walk. So you can imagine. And wherever he was passing, Mao Zedong was getting a lot of support. By the time he reached the end of the other end of the country, he had about 1 million supporters, people who were ready to fight for the communists. So you can imagine, if transportation and communication were good, probably those people will be prevented from going from one end of the country to another. But because of poor transportation, then soldiers had concentrated only in the urban areas, and that led to a success of this communist group led by Mao Zedong. My dear students, let's now go to the third causes of the Chinese Revolution: the feudal system and existence of social classes. One of the very disturbing problems in China, it was social classes. It was social classes. my dear students, you might have social classes, but those social classes can be broken. That means one can move from one social class to another. But unfortunately, in China, if one belongs to the capitalistic class, it means this person is totally separated from the other who belongs to the peasant class. There were also the group of, the group of intellectuals and elite. Intellectuals and elites. These people who were educated also belong to different classes. But also there were others who were the landowners. That means the landlords. Also this belongs to another classes. And there was, there was a very strict demarcations of people regarding their classes. That means one could not be allowed, at least either to intermarry with the people of the other class because, they belong to, they belong either to the higher class or to the lower class. So that's the way it was. And because of these social systems which existed in China, then a lot of people wanted it to be abolished. And remember, socialism, among the things it did, it was to abolish the social classes. So people supported socialism because one of the promises of the socialists, it was to abolish the social classes. And also, in spite of having these social classes, but the social class which suffered the most, as I've said, it was the class of peasants who used to pay a lot of taxes compared to people of the other classes. So people wanted these classes to be abolished. And fortunately, the socialists under Mao Zedong had already promised that if they win the revolutions, they are going to abolish social classes. So because of that, they exploited a lot of support from the Chinese people. My dear students, as you can see, this is the example of social classes that existed in China. The social classes that existed in China before 1949. This is the emperor. There's the emperor who is at the top, and you can see there are some scholars. Scholars means the the elite and the intellectuals. These, of course, were the second, and there were gentry, wealth, and landowners, the landlords. They were also the third. But there were peasants, artisans, and the merchants, and the soldiers. So these are the classes which existed in China. And it was very difficult for one to break from one class to go to another class. That means it was almost like an inheritance. You cannot break easily to go from one class to go to another class. Even social relations was not simple of people who come from different classes. So socialism wanted to abolish these classes, and people supported it because they were sick and tired of these classes. They wanted a classless society. Another point here is the autocratic rule of Dr. Sun Yat-sen and later Chiang Kai-shek. These two leaders they were ruling the country like dictators. First, there was Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Dr. Sun Yat-sen. This, of course, came to power in 1911 after he overthrew the Emperor of China. And after his death, in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek came to power. Chiang Kai-shek came to power in 1925. So you can see this ruled until 1949. These two leaders, they were not only autocratic, that means they were ruling the country in a dictatorial way, but much more worse, they were puppets of the Americans. On the other hand, we can say in a simple word, they were American puppets. They were American puppets. And they cared less about the life of the Chinese people. They didn't care how to improve the life of the Chinese people. So it's because of all this autocratic rule of Dr. Sun Yat-sen and later Chiang Kai-shek that the people of China wanted some changes. There was no democracy. There was no democracy. Life of people were so bad and so on and so forth. So people wanted some changes because of autocratic rule of these two last Chinese leaders, Dr. Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek. My dear students, let's now move to another causes of the Chinese Revolution. And this is the influence of the Chinese intellectuals and students. Some Chinese people went to study abroad. And in studying abroad, they got some new knowledge. They were enlightened. That means those who went to study, for instance, in England, in America, they saw democracy and they saw how democracy is working. Coming back to China, comparing to the way their country is led, in fact, they wanted some changes. They wanted the leaders in power, referring to Chiang Kai-shek and before him, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, they wanted those leaders to be removed because they were autocratic leaders. However, some others also who went to study abroad, they learned about the concepts of Marxism. they learnt about Marxism, they learnt about socialism, they learnt about scientific socialism. So coming back to China, they also wanted to change that system and introduce a new system. But most important, when we speak of the influence of the Chinese intellectuals and students, we can also make our reference to Mao Zedong, or Mao Zedong himself. He started to learn the Chinese at a time when he was a student at University of Beijing, and at that time he was librarian, so he spent most of his time in a library to read the Marxist book, and later he established a study, he established a club of studying, and mostly they were reading the Marxist book and other socialist books. So little by little, they started to grasp that concept of Marxism. So you can see the intellectuals in China and the students, they have played a very major role to the Chinese Revolution, because those people, after studying abroad and others in China, they came back to China with the idea of change, and they wanted to introduce some changes. Another point is the influence of Russia Revolution of October 1917. Russia Revolution was the first socialist revolution. Russia was the first country to practice socialism. Remember, before 1917, socialism was only in books, was only in documents. It was only, it was only in writing. But Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and Leon Trotsky, Bukharin, and Joseph Stalin, the four leaders together, they implemented socialism by putting into practice the writings of Dr. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So you can see the influence of that revolution has made the Chinese to believe that if the Russians have done it so in 1917, also the Chinese can do the same. So on the other hand, we can say they copied what happened in USSR back in 1917. So the Russia Revolution had a lot of influence, but most important, from 1917 to 1949, they also saw a lot of success from USSR. That USSR during revolution was just an agrarian state, but up to the end of Second World War, USSR was one of the powerful country together with the USA. So they, they saw the success of revolution of Russia, and so in China, people wanted to do the same. So this also explains why Chinese Revolution occurred in 1949. It's because of the influence of the Russia Revolution of 1917. Another cause for the rise of the Chinese Revolution, it is the influence of Russia Revolution of 1917. My dear students, in 1917, there was a revolution which took place in Russia. And of course, we've discussed it already. The Russian Revolution has a lot of influence to the Chinese Revolution. Why? Because the Russia Revolution was the first revolution to put into practice the idea of Karl Marx. Idea of Karl Marx was put into practice by the Russian Revolution, and it was very successful, especially when the Chinese people look back to the Russian Revolution from 1917 during the revolution until 1949, when the Chinese also performed their revolution. They looked at the development which was made by Russia at that time, from an agrarian state which was not powerful in Europe to become one of the powerful countries in the world, competing with the United States of America. So Russia Revolution has a lot of inspiration to the Chinese people to support the revolution. But also the Russian Revolution, apart from other things, some people learned from the Russian Revolution that no matter how large the ruling class is, it can be overthrown. Because when you look, for instance, the power of the Tsarist government of Russia could not be compared to what has been the government of China at that time. So for that case, Russia Revolution has a lot of influence to the, to the Chinese, to the Chinese Revolution of 1949. My dear students, let's now move to another cause of the Chinese Revolution. This is the foreign intervention and occupation of the Chinese territory. There was foreign intervention. That means the Chinese territory was always intervened by the foreign powers, and the government in power, led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, was not in a position to do anything. The Chinese territory was grabbed by the foreign countries, and nothing has been done. But also there were so much interference of the political affairs and economic affairs of the Chinese people by the foreign powers, especially United States of America. But the leaders in power, as I said earlier, they were just merely the puppets of the Americans and the Western powers. They were not doing anything. A good example that I can see here, for instance, China, for instance, lost Hong Kong to Britain, and the government did nothing to bring back Hong Kong. China, for instance, lost their influence in Korea. They lost Mongolia. They lost Vietnam. And early in 20th century, they lost Manchuria to Japan, and government of China was not doing anything to bring back those lost territories. So you can see the Chinese people, they were living in fear. They were living in fear because they didn't know exactly where will this occupation end. Will it continue? And remember, the population of China was increasing, as we said earlier in the first point, that in the sense of 1953, population of China was 583 million people. So you can imagine at that time, how many were they? Probably they were more than 300, more than 400 million people, you see? So population was increasing, but land of China was taken. So that brought a lot of fear to the Chinese people. That's why they have to support revolution that will bring the leaders in power who can be able to protect and defend the Chinese territory. My dear students, this is the map that shows how the Chinese land was grabbed by the foreign powers, as you can see. This is Tibet. Tibet became monotonous. It became autonomous, in 1912. The same applied to Mongolia. But here we have this land which went to Russia. There is also this Chinese land of Manchuria, which was taken by the Japanese during the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. This, of course, it was also, this was part of China. But also we have another area like Hong Kong, which was taken by the British. We have Taiwan, which was taken by the Japanese. Also there is this Indochina areas, which were under the influence of the Chinese, but they were taken by the, they were taken by the French, another foreign power. Remember here we are talking of Taiwan, we are talking of Cambodia, Laos, and so on. All these areas were taken. The same applied to Korea. It was under the influence of the Chinese, but they were taken by foreign powers. So because of what really happened, the Chinese people were not happy. They wanted the kind of leaders who can be able to protect their territories and make sure that their territories is not taken by the foreign powers. That's another very important point. Let's now go to another point. This is destruction of the Chinese culture. The Chinese culture was under destruction. Chinese culture was under destruction. My dear students, the Chinese culture was quite different. Was quite different with the culture of the other nations, particularly with the Western nations. For instance, most of the Chinese, they believe in a religion called Buddhism. Others believe in what is called Taoism, and of course others believed in what is called Confucianism. So these are the three major religions of the Chinese. They constitute about 78% of the Chinese people believe in these three religions. Of course there are some other religions, but there are some other people who were Christians. So what shocked the Chinese, it was the wave of conversion that some people, quite a good number of people, I can't say a lot of people, quite a good number of people were converting and become Christians. So the Chinese people feared that their culture is undergone destruction because of the foreign culture, because of foreign interventions. But this goes to another thing, even the way people dresses, the way people eat, the way people walk, the way people do things, and that's what it means by culture. A total way of life of people in China was changing. So people are not happy about this. This explains why in 1966, after revolution, in 1966, Mao Zedong decided to introduce to China what was called the Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution, trying to restore the good Chinese culture, as they were believing that the Chinese culture has been polluted by the foreign culture. So there were that kind of things in China. Destruction of the Chinese culture also became one of the reasons for the Chinese population. People wanted the leaders who can protect and restore the Chinese culture. That is another causes. Another causes for the Chinese Revolution is the role played by Mao Zedong and the Communist Party. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China, they have played a very special role to the revolution. First of all, I said earlier that Mao Zedong, he started to think of this communist revolution after, at a time when he was studying at Beijing University. And there he used to conduct group discussion at Beijing University, where where students were studying about, about socialism, about communism, and so on and so forth. But most important, we are thinking of Mao Zedong as the one who really contributed much to revolution. Of course, there are some others like Chon Lai, and so on and so forth. Contributed a lot to the revolution because he succeeded to manipulate and change the Marxist theory. Remember, according to Marx, he believed that socialism can only be brought by the workers, and only workers, nothing else but workers. This is what Marx believed. But Mao Zedong came to change after he tried the workers and failed, because the working class in China, we said, was very small. So the working class in China was very small. So he failed, and after failing, he turned and started, and think of using the peasants. Remember, even when he was starting his revolution, he was asked the role of peasants to the revolution, and in fact he responded by saying that peasants have no role in revolution. That peasants, they are just like the sack of potatoes in the market. That means they have no role in revolution. But after he tried the workers and failed, later, Mao Zedong or Mao Zedong, he came back and used the peasants. And successful, the peasants brought revolution of China. And this explains why the Chinese and the Chinese and USSR later, they came to quarrel regarding about the methods one used to the revolution. The Russians believed that revolution should be done by the workers, but Mao Zedong believed that revolution can be done by any social classes, particularly the exploited classes which are ready. That he believed that it is intensive exploitation that can be able to bring the changes and nothing else. So, my dear students, as I have said, these are the causes for the rise of the Chinese revolution. After we have looked at the causes for the rise of Chinese revolution, my dear students, let us now continue with another very important part, and this is the internal political impact of the Chinese revolution. Internal political impact of the Chinese revolution. What is the impact of the Chinese revolution? First, let's look at the internal impact, the impact of the Chinese people. The first impact is the emergence of People's Republic of China. China, remember, it was called the Republic of China, but it changed its name from Republic of China to become People's Republic of China. That means a word people there was added to make it sound that this republic, this new republic, belongs to people. So it was called the People's Republic of China, and Mao Zedong or Mao Zedong became his first president. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, it was expelled from China and go to live in exile in Taiwan. In fact, they went to Taiwan and established their stronghold. Taiwan, remember, was part of China, which earlier, as we said, it was under the influence of the Japanese. But after Japan was defeated in the Second World War, Taiwan was taken back by China. But after the nationalists were defeated, Chiang Kai-shek and his group, they went to live in exile in Taiwan, where they established their stronghold. And Taiwan today, it still stands as an independent country, though negotiation is still going on of returning it back to China. This is China mainland, and this is Taiwan. So leaders who were defeated by the communists, the nationalists, they ran and go to establish their stronghold in Taiwan, and this is Taiwan. And Taiwan was supported by the United States of America, and in fact, it was recognized by other 27 countries in the world. Another impact is introduction of Cultural Revolution of 1966. Introduction of Cultural Revolution of 1966. The Cultural Revolution of 1966 was introduced by Mao Zedong because of the fact that from 1949 to 1966, Mao Zedong found it very difficult to implement socialism because of the way people of China were behaving, because of the attitude, because of the traditions that the Chinese people had inherited from the previous government. because of the external influence to the Chinese people, Mao Zedong came to realize that, that socialism cannot be implemented in China. Communism cannot be implemented in China until he introduced some programs of changing the people's attitude. Remember, culture is a total way of life. So he has to change the people's total way of life, that people can start to live a socialist life, and so on and so forth. So it's because of that, after that 1966, one thing which followed immediately, it was the establishment of communes. Communes means means the community village, where people were living together, producing together, and do everything together in their village and community. So that is also what we can say. Mainly this was introduced to change people's attitude and behavior. As you can see, this is Mao Zedong addressing addressing people during the Cultural Revolution of 1966. And these are the children who are reading. They are reading about the cultures of, the new culture of China. We said culture is the total way of life. So people were learning a new total way of life of the Chinese people. A way of life in which the Chinese people now have to follow. They have to follow at least to change their political, social, and their economic affairs after revolution. Let's now look at the internal economic impact. Introduction of 3-5 years development plan. They introduced some 3-5 years development plan which started in 1958 to 1962 in order to change the country's economy. Remember, we said China was largely agrarian, so they have to change the economy by introducing a 3-5 years economic plan. That means 3-5 years economic plan. And of course, this had enabled China to develop in terms of industries, in terms of agriculture, and so on and so forth. Earlier, of course, there was what was called the Great Leap Forward, which, of course, resulted to the death of a lot of Chinese people. It's said about 30 million Chinese people died during that Great Leap Forward of trying to change the Chinese economy. Another thing which also is the economic impact of the Chinese revolution, it was the growth of Chinese economy. The Chinese economy, remember, at the time of revolution, it was typical agrarian. It was typical agrarian. But after revolution, it became industrial. In fact, today, as we speak, the Chinese economy is the second largest economy in the world after United States of America. So you can imagine China has made a lot of development. In fact, they have made use of their large population. They used their large population to boost their economic growth. And China today, as we speak, is one of the largely industrial country in the world. In fact, the second largest economy in the world after United States of America. The third is the introduction of measures to control population. One of the problems which he said has been disturbing China and so became one of the reasons for revolution, it was the rapid population increase. We said at that time there were about 583 million people in the 1953 census. That means back in 1949 probably they were about 500 or so. So the increase in population has been a problem. So the Chinese government introduced some measures to control the population growth in China. And this was done by introducing the the birth limit of the Chinese people. The Chinese people were told to have not more than 2 children. Not more than 2 children. That was by law. And this, of course, has helped a lot, at least, to reduce problems which are associated with the high population. Another thing is the improvement of infrastructure. China, we said, had very poorly developed in infrastructure. Very poorly developed infrastructure because China is very huge, it is mountainous, so sometimes some areas were totally isolated. Some areas were totally isolated. They couldn't have the message or news from Beijing for quite a long time. But today, as we speak, China has been able to develop in terms of infrastructure to become one of the highly developed countries in terms of infrastructure in the world. Here we are talking about the railroad infrastructures. They have got electromagnetic train. They have got a lot of airports, a lot of ports. So China, in short, as we can see today, is very highly developed in terms of infrastructure, probably than many other countries in the world. So they have made quite a huge development on that area. Another thing is the isolation of peoples of China. This is the impact of Chinese Revolution in the world. How the Chinese, what impact Chinese Revolution has brought in the world. The first is the isolation of People's Republic of China by United States of America from 1949 to 1979. That means, just like what we saw to Soviet Union, USA did not recognize China from 1949 during the revolution, of course, to 1979. Why? Of course, it's very simple, because China was a communist country, and the Americans always wanted to isolate the communist countries, as they did in Soviet Union. They wanted to isolate the communist country. If you go back to the Truman Doctrine, that wanted to fight against communism, to contain the spread of communism. And this is exactly what the Americans were doing. They came to restore their relations in 1979. And also, this is the time when the Chinese were giving back their seat in the United Nations as the permanent member of the United Nations. It means before that, their seat was held by Taiwan, because the Americans were supporting Taiwan. They recognized Taiwan instead of China, and so on. Another impact of the Chinese Revolution in the world is that she supported decolonization in some third world countries. China has contributed to decolonization of so many third world countries, and these include countries like Angola, for instance, country like Mozambique, Also, we have other countries like Vietnam during their fight with the United States, first the French and United States. Vietnam, remember, there was very close relations between the former Vietnam president and a nationalist, who was called Min Ho Chi with the Chinese government. They also supported also war in Korea. That means the Korean War supported North Korea during their war with the United States and so on. So you can see the Chinese supported decolonization in some of the third world countries. And also the another impact of Chinese Revolution in the world is that the Chinese Revolution has modified the scientific theory of revolution as explained by Dr. Karl Marx. They brought a modification of the theory. Why do we say that they modified that theory? For instance, Dr. Karl Marx has said revolution, and that was very strict to Marx, revolution will be done by the workers. There is nowhere Karl Marx has mentioned other group. Even Friedrich Engels, they have never mentioned other group that they are they could lead revolution. The only group which was mentioned by Marx, it is workers, and he referred specifically to the to the proletariat. Proletariat, it means the toilers, and he looked at the workers, not the blue, not the white-collar job workers. He looked at those blue-collar jobs, workers who were suffering, and he said, those are the people who can do revolution. But look at what happened to China. He modified that theory of Marx, and in fact, instead of using the workers, he used the peasants. So that was something which was quite new. And so the Chinese Revolution, therefore, it became the Peasant Revolution. So, and of course, this had a lot of influence to third world countries, because if it wasn't Mao Zedong who modified that scientific theory of revolution, and he used the peasant, probably socialist revolution could have not occurred in any of the third world country, because they could not meet the qualification of Dr. Karl Marx, who said revolution can only be brought by the workers. But strangely, Mao Zedong, he used the peasants, and so brought something which was quite new, that the peasants can be used in revolution. So it comes that only people who are suffering, regardless in which class they belong, they can do revolution, provided that they have suffered enough. So he said it is contradiction that bring changes. When people are suffering, then it leads to class struggle or contradiction. And so, as you can see, the Chinese Revolution has modified the scientific theory of revolution, as explained by Dr. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Another thing is the spread of Cold War in the Southeast Asian countries. The spread of Cold War in Southeast Asian countries and Indochina. Remember, the Chinese Revolution of 1949 has contributed to the spread of Cold War. Why? Because the Americans, Americans and other Western countries, they were so shocked by the Chinese Revolution that that revolution can spread to other countries, something which really happened. Because after 1949 revolution followed in Vietnam in 1955, earlier in 1954, in 1950s in Korea, also later in Cambodia, in Laos. So it was obvious that revolution was expanding in Southeast Asia and Indochina. So that led to the spread of Cold War to that area. The Americans came to that area and established different military organizations. For instance, they used to have what is called the SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty organizations, which was a military pact between the Americans and other countries like Philippines. Also, there was CENTO, which was established also in Central Asia and so on. All these were done to prevent the possibility of spread of communism in those areas. So, spread of Cold War in Southeast Asia, therefore, and Indochina is one of the impact of the Chinese Revolution in the world. After that, my dear students, let's now move to another thing, and that is the collapse of Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc in 1990. In 1990, Soviet Union or USSR collapsed, and it did not collapse alone, it collapsed with the Eastern Bloc. Eastern Bloc, remember, we are referring to the Socialist Bloc, which used to have all Eastern European countries which were socialist. It collapsed, and of course Soviet Union, remember, it was the first country in the world to become socialist, and then socialism spread to other countries, including those countries we have said. And in 1980s, Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc started to run into severe economic, political, and social crisis. It's because of those social crises, economic crisis, and political crisis that led to the collapse of Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in 1990s. And as you can see, my dear students, this is the map that shows the collapse of Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc. Soviet Union alone, remember, it was made up of more than 15 republics. But then they started to separate from the so-called Russia. They started to withdraw from Soviet Union. Here there was Uzbekistan, which of course in 1991 there was Turkmenistan also went, Azerbaijan, Chechnya. Of course they wanted to go, but USSR continued to hold them, and there was a civil war here between Chechnya and Russia. Also, there were some others, like you can see Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh also went, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and so on and so forth. So, Soviet Union disintegrated, and not only Soviet Union, but also the Eastern European countries of Romania, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Albania, Slovenia, Hungary, and so on, Czech Republic, they abandoned socialism, and in fact they became capitalists after holding some elections which was won by the liberal political parties and so on. So that is Soviet Union. So let's now look at the reasons for the collapse of Soviet Union. Why Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc collapsed? It collapsed because of the following reasons. One, the economic crisis in the Eastern European countries. The economic crisis of Eastern European countries. They were facing some economic crisis. These people were facing problem of shortage of supplies. Shortage of supplies. By supplies here, we refer to food, clothes, and shelter. This is what we call the basic needs. These people had a shortage of basic needs. And the state-controlled economy was inefficient, could not provide people with what they need. So you could see that always in the street, when you go to Moscow, when you go to Leningrad, when you go to, when you go to Kiev in Ukraine, when you go to Warsaw in Poland, what you are going to see was the queue. People were in a long queue waiting for some services, waiting for some food, buying clothes, and so on and so forth. So these problems were so typical in the Eastern European countries and USSR, and they paved the way to the collapse of those countries because people were tired. People wanted to have the basic needs. People wanted to have their life back. Unfortunately, the government could not give them the basic needs they need. So that led to the collapse of socialism collapse of Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. This is the picture of people in USSR, in Moscow in 1980s. They were in a very long queue buying some food and other supplies, you can see. And this was typical in most of the Russian cities. It was typical in most of the Russian cities. Whether you live in the urban or you live in the rural area, this was so typical. So people were tired of this life. That's why they wanted some changes. Another point is violation of human rights by the most of the authoritarian states. There were violation of human rights. People in these countries, their rights were violated. For instance, earlier during the time of Joseph Stalin, he issued what was called the purge. Purge, it means cleansing, killing people who were opposing him. And this has killed, this purge killed a lot of people in USSR. But not only that, violation of human rights, people, of course, could disappear without a trace. People could be detained, people could be killed. People could be put into jail for a long time without trial and so on. This has been so typical in these countries. So people wanted more democracy. People wanted the respect of human rights. And unfortunately, violation of human rights, therefore, made people in these countries to want some changes. Another point is the infringement of democracy by suppressing the opposition parties, freedom of association, freedom of expression, and so on. There was infringement of democracy. There was no democracy in these countries. And because there was no democracy, it means people have no right of expressing their feeling, to express what you feel. There was no freedom of association. There was no freedom of association. There was no freedom of assembly, so to say. Democracy is it's a very wide term. It embraces a lot of things. And it's because of this that people wanted freedom of association, freedom of press, freedom of movement, and so on and so forth. So they wanted some changes. And this led to the collapse of USSR and the Eastern Bloc. Another point is the decline of science and technology due to lack of competition and discouragement of new innovations. In these socialist countries, there were no competition. And so people were lacking that spirit of making innovations. My dear students, another point here is the introduction of perestroika and the glasnost. These two policies were introduced by the last president of USSR, who was called Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev introduced perestroika and the glasnost. A word perestroika, it means, perestroika means reform or changes. And the glasnost, it means openness or transparency. So these were the two things which, these were the two policies which were introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev. And by introducing these two policies, they gave people of USSR the more freedom to speak, the more freedom to express themselves. And when they were told to make decisions whether to remain in Soviet Union or to go their way, majority of the people within USSR, they voted to separate from USSR. And that's why we said earlier, the 15 republics which used to make USSR, they moved away from USSR and formed the new states, as we saw Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and so on and so forth, because of perestroika and the glasnost. And even people, when we are told to choose, the reforms, they chose a free market economy rather than socialism, which they considered to fail because it could not provide them with their supplies. My dear students, another point is economic and political sabotage done by the capitalist countries led by the United States. There were sabotage which was done by the capitalist country. The capitalist country, ever since 1945, the capitalist countries were trying their best to sabotage socialism, and they were doing whatever it takes to make sure that they destroy socialism and communism. And for that case, they were using a lot of propaganda. They were using some economic sanctions and so on, at least to reach their target. Another point is deterioration of standard of living among the people of East European countries. The standard of living of people who lived in East European countries, it was deteriorating. They were living a very difficult life. As we said earlier, they could not get enough food. they could not get enough clothes. They could not get the supplies which are necessary for the survival of human being. And so these people, therefore, all the blames were put to the socialists, especially when you combine the sabotage of the Western countries with what was happening. When people are complaining about the standard of living of their country, then the capitalists will be there to tell them that it's because of socialism. It's because of socialism. Then it's because of that that people chose at least to go, to look for another life. And that led to the collapse of USSR and Western Bloc. Another point is the suppression of freedom of worship. There was no freedom of worship in these countries. Remember, the doctrine of Dr. Karl Marx, it says very openly that freedom of worship, there is no religion in socialist countries, in the communist countries. Why? Because they say, religion is the opium of the brain. On the other hand, we say religion religion perpetuates what Marx called the psychological alienation. And so some people have invented religion so as to express their, that's very wrong. That some people have introduced religion so as to control other people psychologically. That's what Marx has said. And because of that, all religion were abolished in these countries. So some people, however, wanted to continue to worship in their religions. And that brought a lot of contradiction between the state and the people who wanted to worship the religion. Another thing is nationalistic reasons. Nationalistic reasons. If you ever ask some people that are you a Russians, or do you belong to USSR, or you belong to Ukraine? Do you belong to USSR, or you belong to let's say Azerbaijan? One will say I belong to Azerbaijan rather than saying I belong to USSR. This goes especially to what happened in country like Yugoslavia, where you used to have the Bosnia Serb, the Bosnian Muslims, and also there were Albanians also living in that area. And because of that, it contributed to the collapse of these countries, because some minorities in these countries were not happy. That also led to the collapse of USSR and the Eastern Bloc. Let's now look at the impact of the collapse of Soviet Union, Soviet Bloc to the East-West conflict. What is the impact of the collapse of Soviet Bloc to the East-West conflict? The first was the collapse of Berlin Wall in 1889 and reunification of Germany. This, of course, has already been discussed in the topic of Cold War. This, of course, has already been discussed in the topic of threat to world peace, in that subtopic of Cold War. Another thing is the collapse of USSR and the Warsaw Pact, which used to unite the Eastern European countries. USSR itself collapsed, and the Warsaw Pact also collapsed. Remember, Warsaw Pact was competing with NATO. So Warsaw Pact collapsed, and in fact, that became also one of the impacts. Another point is the former socialist leaders were arrested and faced trial. Here we are talking of socialist leaders like Erich Honecker, who was the president of East Germany. He was arrested and he faced trial. Also, we have others like Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania. He was also arrested and he faced trial with his wife called Elena. You see, and that happened to many leaders and so on. Others, of course, were defeated and they were removed from power. Another point is it led to the end of Cold War. The Cold War, remember, we said it was built upon the basis of ideological differences. So the collapse of socialism and the USSR, it meant that one of the very important pillars of Cold War has also collapsed. So the Cold War came to an end with the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe and the USSR, and the collapse of USSR. Another point is the expansion of NATO and the European Union. NATO started to expand. In fact, they started to expand and take those countries which were the former member of Warsaw Pact. Also, European Union, on the other hand, was expanding to Eastern European countries. My dear students, this is the map which shows the expansion of, the expansion of NATO eastwards. As you can see, some countries like Bulgaria, Georgia, Ukraine has applied, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and so on and so forth. These countries now are becoming the member of NATO, as you can see the key to your map here, my dear students. So there is expansion of NATO to Eastern European country after the collapse of Warsaw Pact. Another point is freedom of worship was restored. Freedom of worship, my dear students, was restored. The church which were banned in those East European countries were restored, together with other religion were given back their freedom of worship. Another thing is it inspired nationalism in Eastern Europe. It inspired nationalism. Even people who were silent, people who, of course we are talking of the minority, who were suppressed, they started to rise and demand for their rights. That's why you can see in a country like Yugoslavia, it is split into many countries. There was Bosnia, there was Bosnia, there was, of course, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Sarajevo, there was Serbia, there was Macedonia, and so on and so forth, because there were people who were living there, and those people, as I have said, they were, in fact, unhappy minority. Let's look at the impact of collapse of Soviet bloc in the third world countries. The one is the end of one-party regime. Of course, this is very obvious. The second is that third world countries in the Eastern Bloc foreign policies were to change. If our foreign policy was focused on the relations with the socialist country, now we have to change our foreign policy. Another point is the freedom of worship was restored, in third world countries. Cancellation of all decrees of technical and financial aid, scholarship and so on. There was decrees of aid which flowed from the East European countries or socialist countries to the third world countries, and that included scholarship. For instance, Tanzania used to get some scholarship to go to study in, in USSR at that time, especially at the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, but those scholarships are no more coming, and if you go there, you'll have to pay for that scholarship. Another point is the collapse of socialism policy and movement in most of the third world countries. There was collapse of socialism and the third world, and socialist movement in most of the third world countries. And another thing, introduction of perestroika and the glasnost in third world countries. Third world countries also introduced some reforms and introduced some reforms and openness. In fact, they accepted a free market economy because now they have no support from those socialist countries which they motivated. The civil war, which were ideologically motivated, came to an end. In fact, there was the rise of another new form of war, which were wars that has been resources motivated. People were now fighting for resources, but not ideology. Those, my dear students, we have come to the end of our lesson of today. Let's break for a while, and when we come back, we'll go to the questions. Welcome back, my dear students. After we have gone through our lessons of today, my dear students, now I'm pretty sure that you can attempt the questions that I gave you the beginning of our lesson, and as you can see them here. My dear students, I gave you 3 questions. By using the knowledge that you have just obtained in this lesson, you can now look at the first question. Analyze the causes of the Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949. Analyze the causes of the Chinese Revolution of 1949. Of course, we have gone through the causes of the Chinese Revolution, and now you know exactly what we mean by the causes of the Chinese Revolution. The first one, if you remember, of course, we said the huge Chinese population, that the population of China was so huge, it was so big, and they were about 583 million people, and the government could not provide them with their basic needs. So that became a problem, because there was very high unemployment, and people were suffering because of famine, people were dying because of famine and so on, and government could not do anything. And also the other point, of course, as we discussed, is the foreign intervention of the Chinese territory. The foreign powers had intervened China and grabbed the Chinese territory, and government was doing nothing. So he said people wanted the kind of government which will be able to preserve the Chinese territory. Also, he said about destruction of the Chinese culture. The culture of China was under destruction by the foreign culture. Also, we said about the poor economy and transportation system. The economy of China was very poor, but transportation system was also very poor and backward. People wanted the improvement in that area. But also, we said about social classes which existed in China. We also mentioned about the influence of the Russia Revolution of 1917, that it inspired the Chinese people who wanted to do the same as what happened in USSR back in 1917. We also mentioned the role played by the Chinese communist leaders, Mao Zedong, and the others, and so on. So, my dear students, those are the answers to this first question. But remember, these questions is to analyze. So for that case, in each point that you present, you'll have to analyze that point. You have to analyze that point. The second question is assess the internal political and economic effect of the Chinese Socialist Revolution. What were the effect of the Chinese Revolution? political and economic effect. If you look at political effect, first it was the transformation of China from being Republic of China to become the People's Republic of China. That means China changed its name to become People's Republic of China. But also there were Cultural Revolution of China of 1966. The government of China, the Socialist or Communist government of China, decided to change its name to become, to become People's Republic of China, PCR, People's Republic of China. And this People's Republic of China, they use the word people. It means now this China Republic, it now belongs to people. It now belongs to people. So that is another internal political impact. But also there were some other political impacts as you can go through them. But if you go at the economic impact, it was the growth of Chinese economy. There were also, Chinese economy grew to become the second largest in the world after the United States as we speak today. But there were also introduction of measures to control population in China. There were also some other impacts. Of course, it included improvement of transportation and communication network in China. Today, as we speak, China is one of the very highly developed countries in terms of transportation and infrastructure. There was also industrialization in China. Also, China developed in agriculture to become one of the large producers of raw materials and food in the world and so on. So there were a lot of improvement in China. They also introduced measures to control population, whereby people were supposed to have only 2 kids. More than that, you could be punished illegally and so on. So this is the second question, and those are the answers to the second question. The internal political and economic effect of the Chinese Revolution. The third question is the collapse of USSR and the Soviet bloc was inevitable in 1990s. How the collapse of USSR and Soviet bloc could not be avoided in 1990s? Justify this statement. Of course, it is true, could not be avoided because of what was going on. That what was going on in these countries, one could not avoid the collapse. Here we are talking of things like infringement of democracy. People have no democracy, and democracy, we said, is a very wide term which embraces a lot of things. Democracy is more than just voting. Democracy include the right to choose leaders, that is voting and be voted, and to vote and to be voted. But also it includes the freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and so on and so forth. All those things were infringed. People in these countries had no democracy. But also, there were violation of human rights. People could be killed. People could disappear in these countries. And, one could say you disappear without a trace. And this was so typical in those, in USSR and Soviet bloc. And also another thing which also led to the collapse of USSR and Soviet bloc, it is things like introduction of perestroika and glasnost. And the problems which you have mentioned, all of a sudden, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced perestroika and glasnost, which gave people more freedom to choose what they want. And most people chose to go away from the USSR. Most people chose a way to, to remove the leaders, the communist leaders, to replace them with either more liberal communist leaders or the all the liberal leaders and so on. This is what happened, and my dear students, you have the answers to these questions I have mentioned. So, going through these questions then, with the answers I just provided it to you, also if you go back and reflect what we have gone so far in the notes, then you can attend this question together with some other questions which may come and related to this topic. My dear students, let's now come to the end of our lesson of today. Thank you for watching and listening, and goodbye. Let's meet next time.